As a result of the Russian Revolution, the Entente powers of World War I decided to send in an expeditionary force against the Bolsheviks. The intervention brought about the involvement of foreign troops in the Russian Civil War in support of the White Movement. The British and French governments sent requests to the United States to join the Allied intervention in northern Russia to participate in the campaign centered around Archangel. The U.S. responded by sending in the American Expeditionary Force of Northern Russia, aka the Polar Bear Expedition. The British and French had two major objectives for this intervention. The first was preventing Allied war material stockpiles in Arkhangelsk from falling into German or Bolshevik hands. The expedition was also originally intended for the recently collapsed Eastern Front. However, the Bolshevik takeover of the front had made this impossible. Therefore, the second objective was to mount an offensive to rescue the Czechoslovak Legion, which was stranded along the Trans-Siberian Railroad since the outbreak of the Russian Revolution and following Civil War. The 339th Regiment was created in June of 1918, composed mainly of young draftees for the purposes of fighting on the Western Front. Most of the 4,487 men were from Michigan, but about 500 draftees were from Wisconsin. The unit was commonly referred to as Detroit's Own, with the motto, "We finish with the bayonet." The 339th Infantry Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the 310th Engineers, the 337th Field Hospital, and 337th Ambulance Company received new orders for the Murmansk expedition. These units were trained and re-outfitted in England with Russian guns and sent to northern Russia under the command of Medal of Honor recipient Colonel George Evans Stewart. They arrived in Arkhangelsk on September 4th, 1918, which had been under Allied occupation since August 2nd, and the Americans came under the command of British Major General Poole. When the Americans first arrived, they were immediately used in offensive operations to aid in the rescuing of the Czechoslovaks. The British commanders then sent the 339th up the Dvina River and up the Vologda Railroad, where they engaged in pushbacking the Bolshevik forces for the next 6 weeks. U.S. rail troops then worked to repair the train line so as to allow the advance along the line to continue alongside French troops. However, these two fronts became hundreds of miles long, which were extremely narrow and difficult to supply, maintain, and protect. By the end of October of 1918, they were no longer able to maintain the offensive and acknowledged their fragile situation. Additionally, Poole was replaced by Major General Edmund Ironside, a seasoned British officer of the Western Front. During the rapid onset of winter, the Allies began to adopt a defensive posture, as commanders also soon realized that they would be unable to raise an effective local force of anti-Bolshevik Russians, as the White Army was not united. They gave up the goal of linking up with the Czechoslovaks and settled in to hold their gains for the coming winter. The Bolshevik army went on the offensive, where they inflicted some casualties and caused the Allies to retreat a considerable distance, but the Bolsheviks also lost a lopsided considerable number of men. After the Entente armistice with Germany on November 11th, many family members and friends of the soldiers of the AEF began writing letters to newspapers and circulating petitions to their Congress members asking for their immediate return. Meanwhile, aware not only of the change in their mission, but also of the armistice on the Western Front, as well as the fact that the ports were all now frozen and closed to shipping, the morale of the American soldiers plummeted hard. From November 11th to the 14th, the Americans took part in the Battle of Douglas, which is also known as the Battle of Armistice Day. Shortly before the battle, the freezing of the local waterways resulted in the cutting off of the Douglas garrison from outside assistance, and the freezing ground let the Bolsheviks move troops surrounding Douglas. The Bolsheviks used this opportunity and their superior numbers to try to attack and conquer the isolated outpost with 2,500 men against 600 defenders, which included 300 American infantrymen, 57 Canadian artillerymen, and about 250 White Russians. During the Bolshevik offensive, the Bolsheviks spent several minutes ransacking Lower Douglas, including a hospital. So communism still sucks. On the first day, the Canadian artillery obliterated the communist advance, while the Americans cut down advancing Bolsheviks with machine gun blockhouses. As night fell, the Allied forces were surrounded, with the telegraph line to Archangel cut by the Bolsheviks, and the prospect of reinforcements were very slim. But the Bolsheviks were driven back with severe losses. On the second day, the Soviets attacked with gunboats and artillery to try to take a bridge, where they were destroyed again by an American blockhouse. However, the Bolsheviks attacked the bridge repeatedly, but were driven back by machine gun fire, each time by only 2 men on a Lewis gun. November 13th saw repeated Bolshevik attacks on the bridge, and all of which were unsuccessful. The Bolshevik forces continued their bombardment, averaging 1 shell every 15 seconds, which was a heavy bombardment even by World War I standards. The Allied commanders decided that their only hope for victory was a counterattack. and in the early morning of the 14th, American forces led by Lieutenant John Coude advanced stealthily to the woods upper near Tuglas, where the Bolshevik troops were encamped. The Americans attacked, making as much noise as possible to make it seem like they had been reinforced, and drove the Bolsheviks back. When they fired to a Bolshevik ammo dump, the sound of the exploding rifle ammunition convinced the Bolsheviks that they were greatly outnumbered. When Coude's troops reached Upper Tuglas, a few Bolshevik snipers surrendered. As a side note, Coude would also have a long diplomatic career afterwards during the FDR administration. On January 19, 1919 came the Battle of Ust-Pagenga, where 47 Americans led by Lieutenant Harry Meade fought against 800 Bolsheviks, and the battle began with a Soviet artillery bombardment. The artillery shells fell for about an hour until the Bolsheviks rose up and began advancing on the American position, firing automatic rifles and muskets, outnumbering the Americans. Once the shelling stopped, the Bolshevik infantry charged, and being outnumbered and outgunned by the Reds, in danger of encirclement due to being attacked from three sides, the Americans retreated. Lieutenant Meade is quoted as saying, "I at once realized that our position was hopeless. We were sweeping the enemy line with machine gun and rifle fire. As soon as one wave of the enemy was halted on one flank, another was pressing in from us on the other side." The American troops conducted a fighting withdrawal, pulling back their forces while maintaining contact with the enemy. As the Red Army neared with bayonets fixed on their guns, Meade and his soldiers retreated while still engaging in combat. They ran through a village from house to house. At last, Meade made it to the next village filled with American soldiers. Of Meade's 47-man platoon, 25 had died that day. Another 15 were injured, but the rest made it out as the Soviets won a major victory with massive casualties. The Red Army's next offensive action was against the Allied garrison at Shenkursk, located on the Vaga River. Allied forces at Shenkursk and the surrounding villages included men primarily from the U.S. and Britain with support from the White Army. The Allies had around 1,600 men compared to 6,000 Bolshevik attackers. The Battle of Shenkursk occurred from January 19th to the 25th, starting on the same day as Meade's retreat, during which time the Americans got no artillery support as they retreated. However, the White Army gunners would also abandon their posts, and by the time American Captain Ojard forced them back with pistols, it was too late to provide any support to Meade's retreating men. 7 men from Meade's squad, including himself, reached Vysokaya Goran and rallied with Canadian field artillery. Over the next 3 days, the outnumbered Americans held against repeated attacks from the enemy, which now numbered over 3,000 men. The fighting took the form of heavy skirmishes, and eventually the Russians began employing snipers to continuously harass the American lines instead of launching more bayonet charges against well-defended fortifications. The snipers inflicted many additional casualties on the Allied soldiers, as well as shrapnel from repeated artillery bombardments. On January 20th and the 21st, the Bolsheviks attacked repeatedly, suffering heavy casualties from Canadian guns. They occupied an empty village but made no progress against Vysokaya Gora. The Allies then reached the village of Sholosha at 7 a.m. on January 23rd and briefly rested before continuing on to the village of Spasko, 4 miles from Shenkursk, where they planned to fight another delaying action and met another Canadian field artillery group led by Captain Mowart. In the morning of the 24th, the Soviets began firing artillery on the Allies in the town. In the afternoon, Captain Mowat was struck by a shell and badly wounded, would be eventually evacuated to Shenkursk Hospital where he would die. Later that day, a Soviet shell struck the lone remaining field gun and destroying it, killing the gunner as well as injuring Captain Ohart, who eventually evacuated also to Shenkursk. The Allied officers then decided that they could not hold Sholosha without artillery, so they ordered a withdrawal to Shenkursk. By 4 p.m. on January 24th, the survivors reached the city of Shenkursk. Some of the Americans were so weary of battle that they fell asleep as soon as they stopped marching, but the Red Army was not far behind them and proceeded to surround Shenkursk with the intention of attacking it the following morning. Captain Ohard then received orders from Ironside to retreat before all being destroyed. As they were almost completely surrounded, the Allied troops escaped through an old logging trail that led north through the forest towards the village of Vystavka. It's also worth noting that during the entire battle, the Soviets claimed that they had only lost 1 man. And that's how you know you can't trust Soviet sources, as they suffered heavy casualties according to every other source. At this point, the battle was over, and the last shots fired were heard some 10 miles away by the Allies at 8 a.m. on January 25th. The fire was from Bolshevik artillery, which was shelling Shenkursk, unaware of the fact that the Allies had already retreated. When the garrison finally reached Vystavka on January 27th, they prepared defenses and withstood several Red Army attacks over the course of the next few weeks. The Battle of Vyshkovka would last until early March against repeated Bolshevik attacks, and the battle would also be the last major engagement of the Canadians in the Russian Civil War. On March 23rd, about 320 British soldiers from the 6th Battalion Yorkshire Regiment and 70 American troops from the 339th H Company launched coordinated attacks on Bolsheviks from positions west of the village. Waist-deep in snow, which prevented the Allies from charging, and heavy enemy machine gun fire repulsed this attack. Simultaneously, 300 White Russians and between 40 and 80 British soldiers assaulted the eastern approaches along the road, also foundering in the face of effective enemy fire. E Company of the 339th attempted to flank the enemy defenses by skirting through the forest north of the road. However, this movement required the unit to cover 3 miles of snow-covered forest in 4 hours. Exhausted from already marching 10 miles and hampered by awkward Shackleton boots, the Americans failed to traverse the forest in time and were ordered to return. The Allies lost about 75 men as a result of these 2 attacks. By the end of March, the Allies had brought up their available artillery from the railroad, mostly consisting of 75mm guns manned by White Russians. They concentrated all available troops from Arkhangelsk and other sectors, including 3 companies of American infantry, 3 White Army companies, 2 Yorkshire platoons, and 1 invaluable section of the U.S. 310th Engineers, which constructed blockhouses for defenses. The last major engagement for the Americans in northern Russia was the Battle of Bolsheviks, which lasted from March 31st to April 2nd, 1919. The Allied force totaled less than 2,000 soldiers and faced an estimated of 7,000 Red Army troops. The Bolsheviks attacked at 8:30 a.m. and were met with point-blank artillery and effective fire from Lewis guns, teams led by Corporal Pratt, who halted the commies, dealing heavy losses. Fighting then shifted to frontal positions as the Red Army launched repeated attacks from Bolsheviks throughout the day. Combined with the added toll inflicted by Allied artillery and devastating fire from the forward blockhouses, along with frontline positions, the Soviets were forced to drive back every attack until nightfall. At 3:30 a.m. on April 1st came the next Soviet attack, where they were once again met by machine gun, rifle, and artillery fire, which drove back all the communists at little to no Allied casualties. The Allies also launched a diversionary counterattack in the west to relieve pressure on their eastern forces in the area. The Allies then planned another attack for the next day, where an American mortar and machine gun team would be attached to a White Army machine gun company to assist a British, Russian, and Polish attack. During the counterattack, however, the British, Russian, and Polish forces suffered high casualties due to belly-deep snow. During the attack, Lieutenant Clifford F. Phillips led a platoon from H Company and rushed from the reserves to cover the British retreat. Lieutenant Phillips was also mortally wounded in the subsequent delaying action, repelling enemy counterattacks for an hour with a few men and 2 Lewis guns until reinforcements arrived. He would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Allied forces then withdrew under the cover of darkness to nearby quarters in settlements in the rear. Many soldiers suffered from exhaustion and severe frostbite, as the temperature was at its hottest at 4 degrees and at its coldest below negative 40 degrees. A heavy Soviet artillery and mortar barrage east of Bolsheviks was met by an Allied counter-barrage on April 2nd. No more attacks followed, and by April 5th the Soviets withdrew from the area, and the battle was won at the loss of over 75 to 2,000 Allied soldiers compared to 2,000 out of 7,000 Soviet casualties, of which 500 were due to frostbite and more were killed by the weather, as the Reds didn't have proper winter clothes. On April 9th, Brigadier General Wilds P. Richardson assumed command of all American troops in northern Russia. However, supreme command continued to be in British hands. American General Richardson arrived in Arkhangelsk aboard an icebreaker on April 17, 1919, with orders from General Pershing to organize and coordinate a withdrawal of American troops at the earliest possible moment, as morale was low and there were rumors of potential mutinies. In early June, the bulk of the American Expeditionary Force in northern Russia sailed for France and then to New York City and home. During their withdrawal, the men of the AEF in northern Russia decided to officially call themselves Polar Bears and were authorized to wear the Polar Bear insignia on their left sleeve. On July 15, 1919, it was reported by the Alaska Daily Empire that 46 officers of the 1,495 men of the Polar Bear expedition were the first American troops to return home from service in northern Russia. The AEF officially then disbanded on August 5, 1919. During their time in northern Russia, the American forces suffered more than 210 casualties, including at least 110 deaths from battle, about 30 missing in action, and 70 deaths from disease, 90 of which were caused by the Spanish flu. On October of 1919, a report gives the casualties as 553 with 109 KIA, 35 dead from wounds, 81 from disease, 19 from accidents and other causes. 305 wounded and 4 POWs were later released. However, a 1929 research found that 226 fallen polar bears had originally been buried in northern Russia. Anyway, Harold Goons was believed to have been the last living American to have fought with the polar bears, being born in 1899 and died on March 11, 2003. Did you know about the American polar bear expedition into northern Russia during the Russian Civil War before this video? Is there anything that I left out or should have talked more about? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.